Hi everyone, this is Alex for Twins, and for today I have a bit of a different kind of video. If you're just beginning and playing micro stakes, it's actually quite difficult to start learning poker as there are so many different resources out there, and it can be extremely overwhelming also because if you don't have someone to guide you, it's kind of difficult to take a good grasp out of them, like what you should learn. Is it theory? Is it exploits? What should you start with? When should you start using a solver? Should you even start using a solver if you're playing microstakes? And I feel like a lot of people have all these types of questions. So in this video, I'm gonna explain to you how I would approach poker if I were to start now and if I was playing microstakes, because the main reason is why this is so difficult is like if you're playing micros, it's gonna be quite difficult to get accepted into a coaching program. For a lot of people, it's gonna be quite costly and they can't really afford getting one-on-one coaching at those stakes. So I've tried to put out a structured guide of how I would approach learning poker without a coach, and if I were to have to do it by myself, what I would do. So that being said, let's get into it. Basically, I've structured this list into things that you should do, in my opinion, before learning a solver. And then we go to theory time. So I think after you go through all these things, you're gonna be kind of ready to get your own solver and start working through it. And yeah, I'm gonna guide you through the steps of what to do. And then we're gonna talk about some useful tools, outside of solver that you can actually apply to, ramp up your learning. So we're gonna go through, getting your preflop in order, bluffing and bluff catching, counting combos, understanding population tendencies, mindset work, and soft skills, and then watching videos. I would say it's quite a big one, but let's take them one by one. So first of all, I would say getting your preflop in order is the most important thing you can do, because the better your preflop ranges, the harder it is to do very big mistakes postflop. We know, like, if you watch my previous video when I was analyzing microstakes footage, our student actually took this a bit too far, in the sense that in order not to get, in difficult spots post-flop, he was just tightening up too much. I think that's a bit of, over-adjusting, and you shouldn't really do that. But what you should do instead is, just get some good ranges. GTO Wizard has a bunch of different ranges for different rake structures that are free to use. So the first thing I would do is get those ranges and start studying them. And when I say start studying them, I don't mean just memorize ranges, like, this thing that was happening in old school poker where you have just ranges all over your wall, printed and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm not saying that's bad to do. I think it's good, but just understand the preflop charts are not, like the Bible, and you cannot get out of that. It's more like simulation that helps you know where to start from. But what you should do is not only memorize them, but try to look at the patterns and properties of different hands. And every time you see something happening pre-flop, especially things you are not that familiar with yet, always ask yourself, okay, what does this accomplish? And then look at the opponent response versus that play. So for example, I don't know, you see if small blind opens, big blind has to 3-bet some very unintuitive combos that if you didn't study, you don't really ever 3-bet something like Jack 3 suited in the big blind. But then if you look at the range, you're gonna notice a pattern. What's the pattern? Well, the pattern is there's a certain amount of hands we want to continue with post-flop, and the best hands are gonna be 3-bet, and also the worst hands are going to be 3-bet. That is because if you have some middling strand hands, you don't really want to get 4-bet, you just want to see the flop, you have a discount to see the flop, but then these bottom range of hands can just get a lot of better hands to fold, and they don't really play that well when they go post flop. Okay, of course, this is a bit of a simplification or summarization, but it is a pattern that you see. And the more you ask yourself, okay, what is this pattern? How can I make sense out of it? How can I apply it? The better you're gonna get with understanding preflop more than memorizing ranges. Also, understand that these preflop ranges should be adjusted. Like if you, let's say, open against someone who's three betting you very, very wide, then you're gonna have to open a much tighter range than if you're facing someone who's almost never three betting you, because you're gonna realize more equity. Of course, like something I forgot to say when I was going through this is that all of these things are gonna go hand in hand, so you cannot really just take them in turn, because the more you learn about one point, the more a different point is gonna make sense. So here you're probably gonna get a bit of a better grasp on how to adjust and why to adjust by also watching videos and try to understand other people's thought process. But what I'm trying to say is that when you learn preflop, you should be aiming for more than just memorizing preflop ranges, but also try to understand them. Of course, if you afford it, GTO Wizard has a new feature where you can actually solve preflop and adjust other people's ranges. So that would be the best option to actually get a better grasp of preflop. But to start, the basic ranges should be good enough. And once you get these ranges, don't just stick to theory and passively learning them, but try to actively think about it when you play. Try to mark hands that you aren't sure if you should open, or if you should call a 3-bet, or if you should ever 4-bet that hand, and then review them after session. Try to, check what you did to the basic ranges, and then always ask yourself, okay, is there any reason I should adjust here? And, doing this process consistently, you're gonna get much better with preflop, and once your preflop is gonna be much better, then automatically your postflop is also gonna become more solid. The second thing I added here is to learn how bluffing and bluff catching works. And the reason I'm saying this, and it might be, I don't know, maybe for some of you it could be a bit too much of a jump, but I feel like what most players struggle with are the bluffing and bluff catching spots. And I think the main reason why they're struggling with it is that they take it as as a spot that's very emotionally loaded. And I feel like that's happens most often because they don't really understand how the mechanics of bluffing and bluff catching works. And if you want to find out more about that, I have an old video that goes through exactly this. So now I'm not going to go super deep into it. I'm just going to try to summarize it. But basically, you should try and get good at calculating odds. So for example, if you're in a spot where you want to bluff your hand, you need to understand how often they need to fold to a certain bet size to make that bluff profitable. And maybe you find this like boring to exercise, but it's one of the basic steps that you should take to become a better player. So, understand every size, how often do they have to fold, and then do the same for bluff catching. I think what's very, very important is that to understand that to bluff catch a certain spot, you should win relatively rarely. So, if they bet pot, for example, you only need to be good 25% of the time in order to make a profitable call. And I guess this will sound familiar to some of you, but I think what most people don't realize is that you need to win 25% of the times. It means you're actually going to lose 75% of the times, and that's still a profitable bluff catch. However, in game, people don't really think about it that way. They just call and they lose, and maybe they lose twice or a third time. and they feel like, well, that must be a bad call. Like, I'm never winning in this spot. When the reality is, in a lot of spots, you actually should win quite infrequently, and that's still a profitable bluff catch. I think the importance of doing this is that it actually takes away the emotional load, and it desensitizes you to, just calling and seeing a better hand and losing. I think that, especially for a beginner, can lead to guilting and feeling bad and feeling frustrated. But if you get the odds well, and you understand that you shouldn't actually win very frequently, that can desensitize you and make you a better player. So the way you do this is asking yourself, what is their worst value bet? And how many better combos do they have? How many bluffs do they need in order to make this call profitable? And of course, at the beginning, it's going to be very difficult to assess this, but this takes me to the next point, which is learn how to count combos. I feel like this is really, really, really important. And if I were to learn poker once again, this is one of the first things I would practice. I actually know a player that, he was a very good tournament player. But and he's a live player. However, during COVID, he was playing a lot of 500 Zoom, and he had a really good win rate in that game. And the reason is not that, like, he was super good at theory or he was super studied, but he was very, very good at counting combos quickly, and that can actually save you a lot of hassle. Also, if you learn how to count combos, that teaches you to think about range versus range rather than, oh, what does my hand want to do here? Or, I don't know, just saves you from a situation where you're targeting a hand that he barely ever has or stuff like that. It also teaches you to pay attention of how relevant certain combos are in their range. So I don't know, I hear a lot of players saying, here they can have king queen, they can have ace queen. Okay, yes, but it's gonna be a very big difference if they can have king queen and ace queen offsuit and maybe a bunch of other offsuit broadways compared to the spots where they cannot have offsuit combos, because the relevance of certain combos in their range is gonna be much higher or much lower. And also, the more you do this, the more it helps you stay aware and away from autopilot. So it's very easy, like, especially if you're a bit later into your session, and just be like, he bet big here, I have a weak hand, and I'm just gonna fold. By contrast, if you're actually paying attention and trying to actively count combos and, asking these questions, like, okay, what's the worst value hand that they can have? It's this one. How many hands like that or better do they have? Well, actually, based on the way the hand went, they cannot really have very many combos. And then you ask yourself, okay, how many bluffs do they need? Well, they need like 4 bluffs here, which are very easy to find. So, actively asking these questions kind of get you out of autopilot. It also makes it easier to make decisions in spots that you've never studied, and it allows you to implement more creative plays. So, in a spot where someone is overbetting, but you can actually have a lot of nuts, maybe if you start actively thinking about this instead of just folding, maybe you're gonna find check raise or check shove on the river, which aren't plays that most beginners are familiar with. But the more conscious you are about this range versus range and combo prevalence, the more you're gonna start adding these plays into your arsenal. And now, okay, very easy to say, but how do we do that? How do we actually learn to count combos? So what I would do here is just mark a lot of hands that get to the river, for example, and just start by counting combos on the river, and maybe start with, tighter spots, maybe like triple barrels in 3-bet pots, maybe even 4-bet pots, because the less combos you have to count, the more the easier it's gonna be. And once you get familiar with, reviewing hands and counting combos in tighter formations, the more you can progress to like wider formations. And of course, now if we are blind versus blind and they see bet, we're not gonna be able to count every combo. And that's not really what we're trying to do, but we can, approximate and get a bit more awareness of how wide the ranges are, how many value combos there are, how many possible bluffs there are. And even if you do this approximatively, it's gonna build a lot of awareness and it's gonna help you really improve your poker skills. Okay, now the fourth thing on my list is understanding population tendencies. And I know this is quite an unpopular opinion, because basically what I'm saying here is that I would actually learn exploits first. And, there's a lot of people out there saying, well, you cannot really understand exploits without understanding theory, and that exploits should come on top of theory, which is true if you live in an ideal world, but I think the reality is that exploits are actually much quicker to learn than theory, and they are also much easier to understand. Also, it's like if you want to get at the tables and be a bit like have some confidence in what you're doing, it's gonna help you build a baseline strategy that you can get by with, especially at lower stakes, where we have to keep in mind that we're playing against very bad opponents. We're not playing against solvers, and not only they are gonna do weird and bad plays, and they are probably not gonna be balanced in almost any spot, but also they are not gonna be aware of what to do. They are not gonna be aware of like your variation in sizings or your range construction and stuff like that. So I think if you learn exploits first, it's gonna give you good base to start with. And you already see there are a lot of like MDA stables out there that don't really teach a lot of theory, and they just teach exploits, and people are doing very good at micro and low stakes. Now, the problem with that, yes, is that if you only base your poker knowledge based on that and population tendencies, at some point you are gonna plateau, and you are gonna, just get behind. But what I'm telling you is not just learn exploits. It just starts with exploits. They are easier to learn. They can give you some confidence, and they can give you a good base, and then start learning theory, because it's going to take you much, much longer to get a grasp of theory than it's going to take you to learn the exploit. Also, what this does, which I find quite important, is that it actually teaches you that the theory needs adjustment. And when you do get your own solver, you're not going to look at it like, the solver tells me to do this and makes this 50% of the times as a call. You're going to be a bit more aware of the fact that, okay, the solver might say this is a call half of the times, but do my opponents actually bluff enough here? Because if not, you're going to know that this bluff catch is actually massively minus EV, and you're not gonna blame yourself for never finding a bluff catch. You're gonna know, okay, in this spot I should probably not find these bluff catches, or maybe I should even look at, my lowest EV pure calls, and maybe even those become a fold. So I think if you focus a little bit on exploits and population tendencies, the way you're gonna learn the theory is gonna do better for yourself in the long run. And the most important thing, which is maybe what I should have started with, is that learning exploits, and especially learning exploits against recreationals, is going to allow you to make the most amount of money versus regs. And why is that important? Because in poker, money comes from recreationals. Yes, you can have a win rate on regulars, but the problem with that is, especially at these lower stakes, rake is generally so high that all the win rate you're gonna get from regs is gonna go back into the rake. So even if you win, you're gonna get just a little amount of EV against these regulars. But against recreationals, you can get a very, very high win rate, and the only way you're gonna get that is knowing how to exploit them and in which spot you should apply these exploits. Okay, so let's say I convinced you and you are ready to learn population tendencies and exploits. Well, how do you do that? And again, it can actually be quite complicated, and I think the easiest and safest way to do that is just to get an MDA course. For whoever doesn't know what that is, it's a mass database analysis course where someone else has already run the data and basically explains to you which spots are overbluffed by regulars, by recreationals, which spots are overfolded, and the best way to do that or is to also have like a good course will also have some explanations of why these spots are overbluffed, what's the mechanics, and this will also teach you some theory, because a good MDA course is not going to just tell you, this spot is overbluffed, therefore overcalled, this is overfolded, therefore overbluffed. It's also going to explain some theory mechanics and explain to you, okay, here, these hands should be called. Most people won't call these hands, therefore we can overbluff. And it's not, it's also going to be a decent guide to starting to understand theory. I think on Run It Once, Free Naturals has this MDA course. There are other courses out there, but I think it's a very good way to start, especially if you're a beginner and playing versus other beginners. Next point on my list is about working on your mindset and soft skills, and not only on theory and strategy and so on and so forth. And I feel like this is quite a big one, especially for beginners. So what I mean by working on your mindset is, first of all, recognize tilt. Now, of course, if you find yourself wanting to punch your monitor or swearing at the tables or stuff like that, I guess for all of us, it's quite obvious there's some amount of tilt in there, but tilt can also be way more subtle than that. So work on identifying these more subtle manifestations of tilt. So identify your triggers, see what kind of emotions come up for you when you're tilted, and also what effect it has on your game. So you don't necessarily have to be raging, but you can just, fold some hands because you're afraid, or, not make some bluffs because you don't want to lose again. And the more subtle manifestations you can find, the more quicker you can work on them. Identify the underlying thoughts and so on and so forth. And this is an area where you should actually put active work. I don't know, maybe get a journal, maybe review your mindset after every session. There are a bunch of different tools that you can use, but make sure you actually use some of them. Also, work on your focus. Like when I say here poker only, it means when you play poker, don't watch YouTube on the side, or don't talk to your friends, or I don't know, don't try to study at the same time. Or I've heard a lot of things working with people on both mindset and in the CFP. So the idea is that when you play poker, you should be only focusing on poker, and you should put quality over quantity. So especially if you're a beginner, don't try to grind 8 tables to get the first place in the leaderboard or stuff like that. Don't play a bunch of Zoom tables just because someone said you have to get 60K hands a month or stuff like that. Just play as much as you can, so you are still able to focus in every decision and ask yourself questions and so on and so forth. And just starting to do this while you're a beginner, it's gonna take you quite a long way compared to other people starting at the same time as you. And also we're gonna expand on this a little bit later, but table and site selection is actually quite a big one. Taking notes and networking. And these are also skills that are going to take you much further than other beginners if you work on them. Next one is watching videos. So this is what I would recommend for most beginners. I know there are a lot of books out there, but I think most of them are quite outdated. And to be honest, it's very, very difficult to apply that knowledge when you play. So what I would do instead is watch videos. I assume that everyone watching this video has a Run It Once subscription. What I would do in that case is I would just try to pick a few coaches that I relate with, that I feel like I understand the way they explain and what they explain, and I would try to follow their thought process. I would always ask myself, okay, why do they think like that? Or what patterns do I notice in their thinking? And I would try to apply those to my game or to my hand review and stuff like that. Because it's much easier to build a solid thought process by following someone that's more experienced than you and trying to learn from them instead of trying to build your own thought process from scratch. And if you try to do that, there's a very big chance you're gonna screw it up. Also, if you just watch every video from every coach, it can be good if you know how to filter information, but it can be a bit confusing because there is no recipe for success in poker. So everyone might approach it differently, but if you just try to relate to 100 different approaches, it's very likely that you're gonna get overwhelmed. It's very likely you're gonna hear conflicting advice. So what I would do is I would just try to stick to a few coaches, particularly if they have like different kind of content, if they mix theory and practice, and I would try to follow and learn from their thought process as much as possible. This was everything I wanted to go through, before you get your own solver and start to build your own theoretical knowledge. I think these are very, very good steps to start. And now let's get to the solver part, because I do think solvers are important in nowadays environment, and if you want to get good at poker, you definitely need to work with the solver at some point. So once I do every step before this, once I get my own solver, first decision to make is, okay, what solver do I get? And I think GTO Wizard AI is the best option out there, especially because this AI version lets you change ranges, simplify stuff. It can pick the best sizing for you if you just want to use one size for a particular strategy. And also nowadays you can add opponent profiles. So you can say, okay, my opponent is Niti, or my opponent is a calling station or an aggro monkey or whatever. So it can also teach you how to adjust. So this is by far, and also it's very quick. So this is by far the best option out there. However, if you don't afford that, the other option is the GTO Wizard preset, where you only have, the solutions made by them. I think, honestly, this is not the best option if you're a beginner, because you're just gonna see some solutions and it's gonna be very difficult to change parameters and understand why that solution happens, which I think is what should be your main focus. So not trying to understand, okay, here I should do this, but instead, okay, here the solver says I should do this based on these parameters. And unless you can change the parameters, it's gonna be quite difficult to understand what's going on in there. Another option are the computer solvers, so no, not the online ones. When I started playing poker, I started with GTO Plus because it's a cheap subscription. If you pay for it once, you have it for a lifetime, and it's quite intuitive. Not as intuitive as GTO Wizard, but it's quite easy to start using it. However, you're gonna need to get good at running sims and building your own sims, and you're gonna have to input sizings manually, which can be a bit of a hassle, and also it is quite slow, meaning especially if you want to run a script where you see strategy on multiple subs, you're gonna have to run it overnight. You're gonna need a computer with decent processing memory. So each of these have ups and downs. Once you get your own solver, I would start by exploring the basics and not the specific strategies. So I wouldn't go into, okay, let's see, I get a solver, let's see how do we play button versus big blind. Of course, you can look at that, but first I would try to understand the parameters that a solver works with. And the most important ones I would say are equity and equity realization. And you're gonna see this is what determines what your EV is. So basically how much equity you have and how much of that equity you're gonna realize. And if you look at different spots, you're gonna see Generally, equity realization is better on drier boards. Generally, equity realization is better when you are in position. Then look at range versus range graphs. So let me just quickly pick an example here. Look at these graphs which is gonna help you understand in which part of the range you have the advantage. Do you have a net advantage? Do you have a range advantage? And try to see, different shapes of graphs and how they translate into strategies. Again, look at equity buckets, which in GTO Wizard you can also find here. So you can look, okay, who has the best hands, who has good hands, weak hands, trash hands, and which are more prevalent in each player ranges. You can also look at it at the advanced way, where it's a bit more exact. And from there, try to understand what determines some sizing patterns. What does a polar versus a mergy range construction mean? Generally, if we go back to the solver, we're gonna see here, for example, this is turn probing. When we bet like this very low equity hands and these very high equity hands, this is going to be a polar strategy. Try to look, okay, how do we construct a polar strategy? Then if we take a different spot, for example, I don't know, let's pick this one, big blind versus MP. You see that this one is a much mergier strategy. So if previously we were betting our best hands and our worst ones, now we're betting a little bit of everything. And once you try to follow these patterns, you're gonna see that in almost every spot in poker, you're gonna have either a polar strategy or a mergy one. And of course, it's gonna be super polar, just polar-ish, mergy-ish, stuff like that. So there's gonna be stuff in between, but generally this is something that you should look for and understand how do we build this, both of these strategies, and also what determines if we want to bet mergy and polar. So before, just jumping into building strategies, I think it's really, really important if you can spend some time and understand these patterns and what they are driven by. Once you do this, then it's time to, just start building strategies. And the way I would do this is start with the most common spots. So button versus big blind versus blind, small blind versus button, big blind versus button. And this is going to take time for you to understand and implement. It's not like, okay, today I'm going to look at button versus big blind, tomorrow I'm going to know how to play. It's not like that. But you're gonna notice patterns and you're gonna get better at it. So when I build strategies, I would try to keep it simple, to use one size per street, maybe two sizes on the river. And one thing I would be constantly looking for is thresholds. So what is our worst value bet? What is the best hand we bluff? Do we prioritize worse low showdown or some other stuff like blockers? And just try to get a grasp of the strategy and why that's happening. And once you do this, always keep in mind population tendencies, because again, this is why I advise you to first learn population tendencies, because the solver is gonna tell you to do stuff that's not working in the game. And the more you know about population tendencies, the more you can adjust that to your own field and to your own tables. And also, once you work off table to build this strategy, in order to get it, in order to really know how to use it and getting familiar with it, shift your focus to the strategies you're building every session. This means before your session, remember, okay, I've studied big blind versus button. These are my takeaways. Let's focus on implementing them this session. And then while you play, mark your hands and then review them after and see how well you implemented what you learned or what still needs work. And this is quite a structured process that is going to help you advance much quicker. Once you do this and once you get familiar with this, obviously the next step to do is to move to less common spots, so spots that don't happen as often, such as under the gun versus big blind strategies, tighter positions, 4-bet pots, so on and so forth, and or more complex strategies. So maybe you just have one size for every street, and then you get a bit more familiar with what's going on, then you can start implementing two sizes on the river, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is how I would approach actually learning strategy, but I also want to give you some useful tools that you can apply and work with at the tables and off tables. And the first one is notes on players. So especially if you learn MDA, mass data tendencies, you should still pay attention at individuals, especially recreationals, and make sure you take notes of sizing and timing patterns. Maybe you notice they change their play when they get tilted, stuff that's really out of line, and make sure to keep the notes quick and intelligible, because you don't want to take like a note that as big as an oval, because you're not gonna be able to read it in game, and you're not gonna be able to make sense out of it in game. And of course this is gonna take practice, but the more notes you take, the more likely some of them are gonna be useful for the future and are gonna allow you to make adjustments that are gonna bring you EV. The other thing, as I mentioned previously, is marking hands. And at the beginning, I think it's quite normal to be unsure of a lot of spots. So if you're a beginner, you should probably mark 20 plus hands per session, or at least pick a number that you want to review and learn every day, something like 10, 15 hands a day, and make sure you mark the spots that are quite small, because the most common mistakes I see with beginners here is that they just mark 2 hands where they lost a stack, even though they are unsure of 10 spots, 10 small blind versus big blind small pots where they don't know if they should double barrel or if they should c-bet. And those spots happen very often, and they compound quickly, even if it doesn't feel like I can make a lot of EV here. So make sure you mark your hands and that you consistently review your hands. And very important when you do that, so when you review your hands, don't look for did I play this hand well? Try to actually understand the spot and understand the bigger picture, and understand why certain things happen in that spot. Why do we take certain sizes? Why do we bet often or not often? Try to just get the bigger picture. Try to see like what's happening with equity, with equity realization, and all the things I've spoke about previously. The other thing on the list is summarize stuff. So when you learn whatever, when you review your hands, when you try to build a strategy, when you look at a video, when you do whatever that's part of your learning process, ask yourself, what have I learned today? What are the takeaways out of this, and how can I apply it further in my game or in my study, or so on and so forth. And the last one is communities. So networking is super important. You're gonna be able to advance much faster if you are talking poker with people, and trying to learn inside a community. And I'm aware a lot of you might not have friends or close people who are interested in that, but try to ask yourself, okay, how can I become part of a community, or where can I go to get some advice or try to connect with people? And some suggestions are run it once forums, so you can post hands there. Coaches are always gonna respond to your hands, and you're gonna see what your flaws in your thought process are. Just make sure you post these hands. If not, run it to us, maybe 2+2 forums. You can find Discord communities out there. Just make sure you get involved and try to meet people at the same level. Try to study with someone and change ideas, review hands with other players. I think that's gonna really, really help you grow much quicker. Okay, this was basically it. Again, I tried to come up with a structured way to approach poker, but the reality is that it's never gonna be as smooth. You cannot really take this one by one and just make sure you tick each of them. It's gonna be a process. Things are gonna, the more you learn one, the more the other one is gonna make sense. But I just try to come up with a structure and, give you some advice thinking of, okay, if I started to play poker right now, how I would approach it if I had to do it by myself. And this is basically the best I could come up with. I hope you guys find it helpful. And yeah, I'll see you in the next videos.